And Asian Studies, yeah?
Yes.
At Manoa.
That's correct.
And we're entitling this show The Timer. That's Ken Gofigan-Kuper. He's at Manoa in Pacific Island Studies. He's a graduate student about to finish his PhD.
Master's, yeah.
Master's.
Yeah.
Well, I can say PhD.
Eventually.
Soon enough, eventually, yeah. And based on his studies and his passion and interest in the matters we're going to discuss, we're calling this Revitalizing Language to Preserve Culture. Okay? So why don't you tell us in a word or two or three what is your master's thesis? What does it cover? And what are you writing and researching about?
Sure. Well, the main title of my thesis is Nalala Hihalata, which basically means give life to our tongues. And born and raised in Guam, only about 20. The latest statistic is only about around 20% or some really drastic number percent of our people speak the language. And so what I wanted to know is, we have a long history of historic oppression, and we don't speak our language anymore. We're very assimilated into, these certain Western ways. And so I wanted to understand, what is the role of language in all of this? Why did they try to oppress language? Why did they care to even attack language and incorporate English? What was the reason of it?
Did they do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
In Guam?
Yes.
Who did that?
There were many of them. I mean, the main ones were naval policies. American naval policies really led to that. They would ban it in schools. My grandmother, in fact, if she spoke the language in school, they would actually let her pay them money. So different things like that. You weren't allowed to play it, and you weren't allowed to speak it in baseball fields. It was the official language of business transactions. And there was even one time where they burnt Tomorrow English dictionaries. So I looked at that history. And I was just trying to understand, why did they concentrate on language? And, around the world, why is language so concentrated on in regards to even empowering people? So I just looked at language and I realized that this is such a core aspect of human society. It's a core aspect of human nature. What is its role in being a people? What is its role in developing a community? So I'm basically trying to understand how language revitalization can essentially lead to revitalizing culture in marginalized groups. So, for example, if a group is kind of taught that their ways have been lesser, their ways are barbaric, primitive, and if they're taught to believe that, can revitalizing the language lead to a reversal of that frame of thought? Can a revival of the language lead to a internal awakening of a people and saying our ways aren't lesser? We've been lied to this whole time. We need to stand up and kind of realize that there are different ways of knowing, that there's not just one way of knowing anything. And so that's basically what I'm concentrating on. I get into a lot of history with kind of the language policies that occurred back in my island. And then I also I like to take frames of reference from other indigenous communities who have also gone through these language changes, such as the Maori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm here because I like to learn from the Hawaiians who had their language renaissance and their language revitalization movement is extremely strong right now as well. So my thesis is really just it's a beautiful synthesis of, can we know differently from the language that we speak?
Well, you've laid out a blueprint for our discussion, Ken.
All right.
Sounds like we got plenty to discuss.
Yes, we do.
Let me try to begin at the beginning so people will understand about Guam.
Yes.
Okay, for one, because that's your origin, your orientation. Guam is a polyglot, just like Hawaii, isn't it? I mean, it was a melting pot, but there were various cultures involved, various languages. Tell us who was involved in the cultural creation of modern day Guam.
Sure. Well, about 4,000 years ago, our ancestors first came, the indigenous peoples, which we call Tomorrows, and we developed.
Spell that.
Spelling is another contentious issue. Some people spell it CH, which is one letter in the Tomorrow alphabet, AMORRO, or CHAMORU, and that was another contentious issue that we can talk about later with language, just orthography of a spoken language and transferring it into a written language. There's politics behind that. So we were the indigenous peoples, and in the year...
So Chamorros were the ones who were there first.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Where did they come from? Because the Pacific is, people came from somewhere else originally.
Sure.
So.
Well, if we're going to go into Western scientific theories, they say that it's areas of Southeast Asia. I've heard one account of the Philippines, but Chamorros, with the Chamorro epistemology, we believe that we came from our creators, Puntans and Fauna, a brother and sister who created the entire universe, with Puntan's body and Fauna transferring herself, becoming a rock in which the first Chamorros came out of. So those are but if we're going to go into scientific theories, they say about areas of Southeast Asia, and I've heard the Philippines.
Polynesia?
No, actually, no, not Polynesia. We were kind of a different migration period. So
when was that?
Scientifically, about 4,000 years ago, we inhabited the islands, and according to scientific evidence or things like that, areas of Polynesia were inhabited maybe as like 1,000, 2,000 years ago. So about 2,000 years before that, if we're gonna fall into, scientific theory. Yeah.
So the Chamorros lived there.
Yes.
And were the base culture for Guam. Mm-hmm. You say islands. Is there more than one island?
Oh yes. What is now called the Mariana Islands.
That's all really Guam.
No. It's we have Guam. There's Saipan, Luta, Tinian. So those are the 4 inhabited islands currently. But we're politically divided because of colonial historical factors. But prior to that, we were all connected as one archipelago of islands, and which is now called the Mariana Islands.
Okay, and was this one political unit, all of these islands, or was it separate?
Well, for the most part, I think we're all like one people, pretty much one culture. Mm-hmm. There was a sort of they call it a caste system that was involved, but I don't think it was necessarily one island versus the other or anything like that. It's not like now it's politically separated, but back then it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. So now we're talking today about Guam, the
yes.
one island of Guam.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And so things existed with one culture, one people on Guam for a long time, thousands of years.
Yes.
When did Western influence arrive?
Well, in 1521, that's when Magellan first came, and they kind of, for a while, didn't really do much with that. That was like the first contact. We were the first Western contact in all of Oceania. But it was really in 1668 with the priest, Father Sanvitoris. He really wanted to Christianize the islands, Christianize the Chamorro people. So from 1668, they established a colony, like a huge presence, bigger than 1521. From 1521 to 1668, it was occasional stop-bys because there was this galleon trade going on. But in 1668, that's when it mainly started, and that's when our people started to become influenced by Spanish customs, Spanish ways of life, Catholicism, and as well as the incorporation of Spanish words into our language. So that's kind of where you see a shift of Western influences, really around the period of Christianization in the island.
Was Christianization peaceful or was it violent? In some places in South America, the Spanish decimated the local population.
We were the same. There were many instances. There was actually a war, the Chamorro-Spanish War. For example, one of my favorite Magadlahis, which is the male chief, Magadlahi Matapang, he actually was the one who killed Father Sanvitoris, and it dealt with a conflict over, not only a conflict over just the general Christianization and forcing people into different ways, but it also dealt with the baptism of a family member. And so for us, there were instances of villages burning if you didn't accept Christ. It became very, very mixed in, because while you had Father Sanvitoris who, seemingly really tried to do it peacefully, there also had the military, like the Spanish kind of military officers, more military personnel. You know, there's a guy named Quiroga who was a very brutal Spaniard who came in, and they would burn villages. And there's even, you know, the Spanish War was pretty brutal.
When was that?
Around the 1670s. Yeah, like one of our most famous speeches by this Magalahi Hurrah, who
You're speaking Guamanian now?
Chamorro language, yeah. Magalahi means like a male chief.
Okay, but when you make these references and speak of these names, these are Chamorro words.
Oh yes, Hurrah was his the name that we know him by.
Okay.
And so, you know, that was kind of a rallying speech. That was around 1671. So it was about that period of time. So it really happened. You know, we were left alone for so long, and it wasn't until really 1521, first contact, and then 1668 with a really rapid expansion of Western influence in our islands.
Okay, so right now, are people Christian or Catholic in Guam?
Very much so.
So it looks like they prevailed, huh?
I mean, if you kill people long enough, and if you spread your propaganda in the most violent way possible, and you kind of try to decimate the population, there are estimates that there was a time in which we were a few thousand. You know, I think one was about 2,000 people left, and then you start to intermarry with the local woman. You know, the women though, they kept the language alive for as long as it's still living. They kept the culture alive.
Isn't that always the case?
It is. Yeah. One thing about Chamorro society is that we were matrilineal, and we really respect our women, and to this day, that's really evident. You know, I mean, your grandmother is your core. You know, in a lot of families.
I think that's very true, even down to the DNA.
Yeah.
So, anyway, okay, there came a time when the Spaniards were thrown out of Guam.
Yes.
I guess that was the Spanish-American War in the U.S.
Yes.
And 1898.
Mm-hmm.
What happened? I mean, what was it like before, and how did it change things in Guam?
Sure. Well, you know, up until then, it was purely Hispanicization, right? And then 1898, with the Treaty of Paris, you know, the Spanish-American War, there was also Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, you know, all kind of quote-unquote spoils of war.
That war cast a long shadow over a lot of places.
Oh, yeah,
Everything changed in many places.
Oh, yes. It was really vast expansionism of America manifest destiny in oceanic region. You know, even as far as Cuba, you know, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and then that was also the annexation, I believe, of Hawaii. Am I correct? 1898. 1893 was the overthrow.
That was part of the war, but
it was just like that year was very pivotal. So what happened is that the Navy took over, and basically it was whoever was the highest ranking naval official became pretty much the governor of the island, and there wasn't really much communication between. And from what I understand, the American Navy, yeah. The American Navy was kind of the ruler of the island. They kind of incorporated a lot of policies. You had I believe the word is naval dictates. Really, they had like dictate after dictate. You can read over it, and so that's when a lot of things started to change in regards to Americanization, this sort of Westernization, and also, most importantly, was the real attack on the language. So that's when it kind of started.
Yeah, I'm reminded of an article that appeared in the New Yorker 10 years ago called The American Raj. And it was about naval officers in their whites and how they had a royal side to them, especially when they were overseas. And I guess that's exactly what happened in Guam and the Philippines, too. Anyway, okay, now the language changes. And I guess by fiat or otherwise, everybody in Guam gets to speak English after 1898.
Well, it took a while. Like 1898 to, I believe, post-World War II, it was a real attempt to kind of decimate the Chamorro language. But, you know, you have accounts of a lot of naval officers getting really frustrated because Chamorro just refused to speak English. They would go to the schools, they would speak it or something like that, but as soon as they went home, it was done.
So is it that the American Navy, the American Raj, if you will, wanted to stamp out the Chamorro language?
Pretty much.
It was an affirmative decision, so they could, I guess, better control the place.
Absolutely.
That was the idea.
Absolutely. You know, there's a lot of literature that speaks about, you know, we can get into that maybe later, but just the role language plays in how people view themselves, right? But I think what happened is they really wanted English to be this lingua franca and kind of be an overarching language.
Yeah, part of manifest destiny.
Exactly. You know, you don't just
shore to shining shore.
You don't just colonize places, you colonize minds, and one way to colonize a mind is a language. I mean, that's just a very effective way to do so.
Yeah. So it affects the people because they don't have the choices they used to.
Absolutely.
So was this part violent too? Were the Americans violent in Guam in order to bring everyone under their control?
Well, it depends on what our operational definition of violence is. You know what I mean? Physically violent, I wouldn't say it was as bad as, you know, the eventual 3-year Japanese occupation, but mentally violent, it was more intense. I mean, violence, sometimes physical violence and mental violence, you know, they're one and the same in degree of brutality, in the degree of how harsh something is. You know, just because I didn't, let's say example, like if someone physically kills another person, that person is dead, and that's physically violent. But if one convinces that person that they are nothing, that they will never do anything, they're essentially killing them themselves. You know what I mean? And then you also pass that attitude down to maybe their children, to their grandchildren. So, you know, just because something's not physical does not mean it's as equally as violent. Happening? Oh yeah, I mean, you had, for example, I mean, after this really long time after post-World War II, a large reason why many Chamorros didn't teach the language to their children was simply because, or not simply at all, was because they didn't want them to go through the same things that they did. Through propagandistic tools.
They didn't teach Chamorro language to the children. They didn't want them to have the problem.
The problems.
Dealing with the overlay of American culture.
That, and also there were things, propagandistic tools, such as the Navy, such as the Guam Recorder, which is kind of this, it was this newspaper, and it would have like articles and periodicals saying how English is the key to success. If you don't teach English to your children, they will not succeed in life. By teaching Chamorro to your children, you know, they'll have an accent, and you know, these are some of the reasons that I've been told. You know, you're going to have an accent, you're going to get teased in school, you'll never make it in the universities, so you're really not going to go anywhere. So, as much as you know, our ancestors, a lot of them regret not teaching their children Chamorro, it actually came from such a huge source of love. It was, we don't want to teach you the language because we went through so many hardships with this. So we're doing this so you can have a better life. But you know, now, you know, currently we're kind of realizing that's not the case.
Well, this is Ken Gofigan-Kuper. He's a graduate student, a master's candidate at Manoa, Pacific Island Studies, and we're talking here today on Island Insights about revitalizing language in order to revitalize culture, and it's a very interesting discussion. So let me go back to you know, the comparison that is compelling here, because this kind of thing happened in the late 1890s and in the early part of the 20th century in Hawaii too.
Yes.
Hula was outlawed, and I think the language was discouraged, the Hawaiian language, and it you know, was part of trying to, you know, a forced assimilation into American culture, and it didn't come back for a long time in the same way. So now it's back. It's back for both places, and you grew up. Something in your life made you want to tackle this whole subject. What was it that made you, you know, get involved here and start thinking and reading and writing about it?
Well, when I was young, I wasn't taught the language as a child. When I reached the age of 8, my father and grandmother really wanted to say, hey, we should teach him the language. And I was a stubborn little kid, and you know, I was 8 years old. I didn't know what these sounds were. I didn't know what these noises were my grandma was trying to teach me. So I would, you know, close my ears, I'd run around, and then I realized it was actually, my awakening happened in college. You know, I took a Guam history class. I took
Which college was that?
University of Guam. I stayed home, and that was the best decision I ever made, was to go to college back in my island, because it really led to me understanding these things that, were successfully kind of on the outside of the discourse surrounding the island. Yeah.
This college and your home is in Agana?
The university is in Manila, back in Guam. So it's close to Agana. Go up a hill and then just 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the most. So I realized, and there was also this moment, because it also occurred with, they're trying to build up the military. There was a huge thing, and
You grew up in the 80s?
The 90s. Born
Sorry.
1990.
I went to Guam for the first time in 1965, and it was a military camp. It was during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Anderson Air Force Base occupied an enormous amount of land.
Yeah.
And there were American soldiers everywhere.
Yeah. It's pretty much the same. I mean, 1/3 of the island is currently, quote unquote, owned, controlled by the United States military. You have the two main ones. In the north, you have Anderson Air Force. In the south, you have the Naval Exchange. We have various middle locations. And so, they were planning to build it up more. It was a shift from moving Marines from Okinawa to Guam.
Yeah, it's happening now.
Yeah. And so, there was that huge, and then also with now these, quote unquote, Asia Pacific pivot that Obama mentioned. But it was just that kind of feeling. And I did some more research, and then I just kind of realized that for so long we've been, I can name more, at that time I was able to name more US presidents than I was able to influential people from my people, influential people from my island. And so there was just this real huge, how do we measure what we know, and how do we prioritize what we know?
It's a whole issue about imperialism and
Exactly.
territoriality. See, Guam was, after the Spanish-American War, what was Guam's political status? Wasn't a territory of the United States. It was I remember in World War I, it was a protectorate. It was organized by the United Nations, wasn't it? Something like that.
Well, I mean, it's weird. The evolution of political status. Political status is such a huge issue right now. Right now, we're known as unincorporated territory of the United States, which basically means we're foreign in a domestic sense, but domestic in a foreign sense. So that's really kind of where we stood. And it's weird because, after World War II, the rest of the geographical area known as Micronesia was put under something called the Trust Territory. But Guam was not part of that. We were kind of always isolated, made on our own. So pretty much we were kind of like this lily pad to the frog known as the United States military,
Well, I mean, what I get, correct me if I'm wrong, what I get is that the people in Guam, like you, not particularly happy with this history. And when you turn around here in the year 2013 and look back down the field, this is not something you would have preferred.
No, there are a lot of us who feel this way, but sadly there are a lot of us that don't, and that shows kind of this vestiges, or not vestiges, but the current colonial project that still exists. And so we're trying to help, I wouldn't want to say in direct opposition, but by presenting different histories, by presenting different languages, a different way of knowing. I mean, I think that's a way to look at it, is by the introduction of alternatives. We can help to lessen this effectiveness of the colonial project. But there are a lot of us, and that's one of the hugest struggles back home, is sometimes you're fighting against your own people.
Yeah, and not too long ago, there was a visit here by the president of Palau. It was just 2 weeks ago. And Palau is trying to connect up with Hawaii and the United States and do business. Okay, and they're trying to send their kids to American schools. They're trying to, make deals with American companies and so forth. And so that what you said before really rings true in that. It's speak English. It'll give you greater options. Don't have an accent. Be one of the boys. Sound like you come from Iowa. You'll be happier in your life. You'll go further. You'll have more opportunities. And so in Palau, I think a lot of people feel that way, and they're trying to connect up with the U.S. as somebody who can help them. Of course, they're part of the U.S. anyway, in the sense that the U.S. funds their government and does a lot of things for them.
Free association.
I'm not sure that you're right.
Yeah.
But now the same with Guam. I mean, when you on the one side with your peer group, your cohorts, so to speak, would like to revisit this whole issue about language and culture and independence from the mantle of territorial culture. There are other people who like to go to Stanford and work on Wall Street.
Yeah.
And they can if they want.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question I put to you is, are the two inconsistent? Can you do both?
Well, I think that, for example, one of the hugest things in regards to academics and what you choose to do in your professional life is, if you were raised, I mean, we're a very collectivist culture, right? Community was everything. Community is still pretty much everything back in Guam. So if you want to be, for example, if you want to go to Stanford, go to Stanford, right? But what are you going to do at Stanford? And how are you going to contribute back to the Chamorro people, back to the community of Guam? And I think that's the most important question to ask yourself is, how are you framing your future? Is it purely from this, I want to make sure that I become the most successful person alive, but I don't want to give back? There are many people who leave the island, do something pretty amazing, but never come back. I mean, not only do they never physically come back, but they never mentally or emotionally or even just with their gifts, they never come back at all. So
you're talking about Hawaii in general now. You're not even talking about the Hawaiian people. You're talking about this place, because we have a brain drain as big as all outdoors. We pump out our best and brightest, send them to the mainland. They never come back. And aside from family connections, they never have anything much to do with the islands anymore. And every island has that, around
Absolutely.
the world. Every island has a brain drain and people who leave and don't come back. It's the nature, of the world, of humanity.
Yeah.
So nothing new there. But the question that makes me curious is there something in the Chamorro culture, that brings you back, that says, Ken, come back. Don't leave. We need to be connected.
Sure. I would say it's everything about the Chamorro culture. I mean, our ancestors, that means, our ancestors, I was talking to another one I met, people, we would say that to each other,
Which means?
Our ancestors. So ta at the end is an inclusive marker of our. So, if you're speaking to another Chamorro, that's what you'd say, like, it's very inclusive. But I feel that they're just everything about the Chamorro culture and its core values. We have core values under this blanket called Inafat Malik, which means the act of making good for one another. And that's our core value. Under that, we have various, in English, respect, appreciation of your elders and just deep respect and reverence for your elders. We have Tentuli, which is the system of reciprocity. So I realized that if we continue to go into these, only Western ways, only American ways, and we lose this, then who are we anymore? If we lose the language, if
you're
we lose
assimilated.
Exactly.
I mean, but you're not the only ones who would be assimilated. What's interesting about islands and island cultures is that they're not that hard to find, which is maybe why some imperialistic countries want to stamp out the language, because it's very easy to find it. It's right there. It's not running away. It's right there when you find it. My family had a culture from Western Russia, which that's gone. And I hope that parts of it remain, but I think that we live in a time in the 21st century where all cultures are being leveled, and I think that's probably part of your concern, that all cultures are being leveled. And you have a sort of an ideal opportunity to revitalize and preserve the Chamorro culture where some other cultures can't be. I told you before, we had a speech, Chrissy Gofigan, your namesake, and I went to a speech by a man named Lyle Campbell, who teaches at University of Manoa, and he has done a lot of work in identifying languages that are going extinct why they've gone extinct and how serious that is for the people involved, and how as the language goes extinct, so goes the culture. And as you say, your proposition is as the language is revitalized, so the culture is revitalized.
Yes.
This is really important because if one goes and the other goes, there's, as you say, nothing left. So what is your paper arguing for? Is it arguing for revitalization? And if so, how can you achieve that?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to point out that, I don't, because it's so important, because I don't think it's a leveling of all cultures. I mean, I feel like it's under the guise of leveling all cultures, but in fact, the main Western capitalistic structure is the overarching. So any other opposing cultures who have different values, you want to sort of level that, but as long as Western capitalist ways sit on top. So I think it's like under the guise of leveling all cultures, but I drastically think it's about the hegemony and the dominance of a certain Western
no
culture.
about it. But I would offer this thought on that, to say that Western culture is a polyglot all in itself.
Oh,
it wasn't too many years ago, but when Western culture was thousands of cultures.
Absolutely.
And now they all got blended somehow.
Yeah.
And then, of course, now the question is, do they blend with cultures that have not yet been blended into them, like yours?
So, and for my paper, it's arguing that we need to revitalize the language, right? It's very important to do so if we, because estimates around, after my grandmother's generation passes, they're like one of the last generations that are like fully fluent. So after that, the number of
Your
speakers
grandmother
goes
is
down.
fully fluent?
Oh, absolutely. My grandmother's fluent. Then the number of speakers will decrease by a significant amount. So we have to work now within the next 20 years to really help that. There are many ways. Back home, the language revitalization movement is, we have so many people that are hardworking. My mentor, Dr. Michael Lohan Bavakwa, he hosts language pockets, where for free people can come in and you learn the basics of the language. I do the same thing here. We call it Ifenak Mata Nihila, and I do it every Saturday morning, and we basically, anyone who wants to come, tomorrow or not, we meet at Kakuaku Kitchen, you know what I mean? It's just like we order breakfast, sit down at the table, and we just work with each other. And, I'm assisted by wonderful people, and I'm actually, another mentor here, Brant Songsong, who teaches the language at the university. He is kind of my overseer. And so language pockets is one way to do that. Make them for free. Not only does it bring a sense of community, but it brings, if you have people wanting to learn the language with you, it kind of motivates you to learn the language. So I'd say language pockets. We have this place back in Guam. It's Hurao, a school. They teach the youth tomorrow. It's kind of like this summer program, after school program, where it's similar to immersion schools in a way. And then you have create music, create poems. But the most important thing is to make the language natural. A lot of people talk about making language a trend, right? So if you make the language hip and cool, then we could bring it back. I disagree with the premise because trends die. But if you make the language natural, if you find a way that it becomes just this everyday part of life, you have to find different outlets to do that. But that's what will truly work, and I think it's going to take a lot of these sources of power in Guam. So the Catholic Church, very, very, very powerful institution. If they started becoming more proactive in perpetuating Chamorro language, we'd have a lot more done. Music's very popular. If you have musicians create music in Chamorro, and especially songs, contemporary music too, rap, heavy metal, rock, if you have writers writing amazing poems, making films, and I think the biggest thing is not to make the language appear as something extremely sacred that should not be touched unless it's used for this purpose.
You have to make it a living language.
Exactly. Absolutely. You have to make it so with every aspect of life you can use it. If you want to, and my mentor always says is, he wants to write the first Chamorro erotic novel. And what's the point of that, right? But it's about...
People will remember.
Exactly. It's about realizing that if we can write about it in English, we can write about it in our own language. And
Let me take a moment and just say, for a station ID, this is Ken Gofigan-Kuper, UH Manoa graduate student in Pacific Island Studies, and he's writing his master's thesis about the Chamorro language and how it can be revitalized, and how revitalization of that language leads to a restoration, a preservation of the culture of the Timuran people, which is all really, really interesting and something we can learn from. So going down that track, though, you're not alone. I mean, and Guam is not the only island, as I mentioned. There are many places in the world, and there are many languages which are at risk of becoming extinct. And your research for this paper has to be global, so you can find, anthropological connections there. So what have you found?
Well, what you find, especially when I read about this, is that when you're talking about oppressing people, language has been a way to do that. So that one was kind of this overarching theme, is like, okay, in regards to colonization, one way is you have to colonize the mind through language. Really great author, Ngugi wrote this book called Decolonizing the Mind.
That's very good.
Yeah, it was eye-opening. He was actually here in February for a literature conference, and I met him. It was extraordinary. But he talks about how the bullet was the means of physical subjugation, but language was the means of spiritual subjugation. So what I found is that is the overarching theme, So what my paper aims to do is, through a Chamorro framework, kind of argue that around the world in which languages have been oppressed, and there are certain communities in which there are only like 2 speakers of their language left. You have examples in which there are no more speakers, but this one lady would constantly dream, and it was her ancestors speaking to her, and so she revitalized the entire language like that, using different road signs and examining old documents. So I realized that it seems like this is something that we care about, right? Because we spend so much effort, around the world. I've seen that effort has been placed on language. The Maori.
It's true. We're in a renaissance, aren't we?
Absolutely.
It's like a few years ago, everybody was busy assimilating into the larger languages, the more popular languages. Now everybody treasures these cultural languages. They want to find more. They want to prevent against extinction.
Absolutely.
Why? Why is that?
Well, one thing that I've learned doing this research is that language is the window into a culture. Through language, you realize just who a people are and what they believe and what they stand for. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, when he was here, he actually said that language is the key to the marketplace of a culture's epistemology, of what they believe in, of just their different ways of knowing. It's just an incredible metaphor. And he was talking about how many of us have the key to the English language. We have the key to many other languages. People are increasingly learning Chinese. But if you don't have the key to your own language, none of that matters. And so...
Well, what Lyle Campbell said, which sticks in my brain, was that every language, or rather every culture, has something to offer.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you can see things from many ways, many points of view, and no culture has it all.
Oh.
So if you want to, look for the larger picture of human experience, you have to see as many cultures as you can find, because they all give you gifts. Everyone gives you its own gifts. And if you lose the language, you lose the culture, and you lose the gifts. That's pretty much what he was saying.
I agree with that. And the sad thing is that if it's your own language, you're not only losing gifts, you're losing core aspects of your being, right? You're losing the blocks of who you are. For example, in our language, the way a lot of us refer to kind of our ancestors as, another word is Tautamona, which literally translates to Tauta, which is people, Mona, which means front. But it's funny that the ancestors who lived way in the past are the people in the front. You know what I mean? What does that tell you? It's that we have a very different view of history. You do not turn your back on the ancestors. History is not, the past is not something to be like, all right, you're done with. But you look to them for inspiration and guidance. You look to them as to how you can better create your life. And so there are little things like that. For example, the word for blood and the word for daughter in the Chamorro language is almost exactly the same, with the exception of a glottal stop. Haga and Hagat.
So is it a coincidence?
No, absolutely not. I mean,
why is blood and daughter the same?
because it speaks to the matrilineal nature. The blood of the people was continued through, if someone was your daughter, since it's a matrilineal, your blood is transferred through your daughter. So pretty much your daughter was your blood.
You're more than a linguist, and you're studying more than linguistics. You're an anthropologist, and you're studying the whole culture of the Samoan people. And I just wonder, when you finish this paper and you get your master's degree, what's next for you, Ken?
Well, I don't think I'm an anthropologist. My anthropology is pretty problematic, but I do think I'm
Well, tell me what you are.
I'm a Chamorro person who wants to help indigenous peoples around the world.
But see, that's my point. It's not limited to
No,
Chamorros.
absolutely. No, it's not.
See, this has got to be global if you
Yeah.
can make this level of effort about it.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. I want to learn from everyone, and I want to contribute what I can to everyone. And so, in regards to what's next, it's a large part of it, I think, is about continuing to make connections, right? Not only through looking at histories and realizing what are the connecting factors, right? But also through talking to people. I think, talk story is one of the most transformational experiences people can have. When you sit down with another person, it's kind of like what we're doing now, and you just talk story. These are connections, and we exchange ideas, and whether or not we agree, like you said, the language is just by exchanging language. I'm giving you gifts and you're giving me gifts, and we can take it away at the end of the day. We may not take everything away, but there are certain things that can be like, well, I remember what you told me in this one conversation when we had this interview. So I think that in the future, in regards to language revitalization and revitalizing culture and fighting oppression through language revitalization, it's important to seek people out. So, I do my Chamorro language pocket here. I connect with, okay, how are the Kanaka Maoli? How are they? Can I learn from them? Is there anything that you can take from me? For the Maori, when I'm going to Aotearoa this summer, I'm going to actually learn from them. And
In New Zealand.
In Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I really feel like it's about connecting to each other as human beings. And I think that's extremely, it transcends academic papers. It transcends, you can send someone, like, I can write this thesis, right? And hopefully it will have impact. I'm hoping it's eventually a manifesto. But
Wow, a manifesto.
yeah, I'm hoping.
It's okay. Now a manifesto. I'd like to explore what you mean by that, because that has a significant, dimension to it beyond writing a thesis,
Oh, yeah.
or for that matter, a PhD paper.
Sure. What I mean by manifesto is one of the problems that I find with academics and some of the literature in which I read in my program, and also extracurricular reading, is that the language is so, the language used, I'm not talking about English versus another language, but the English language that it is written in has been it's so academic, it's so isolated to specialists, to people of an ivory tower. But I want to learn how to take all these concepts in which, a lot of people would have to read day after day to try to get familiar with just what the heck this writer's talking about. How do you take these concepts and make it so that it's relevant to the everyday experience of your grandmother and your cousin and
yourself.
And yourself, exactly. How are you relating this writing to yourself? If I sat here and be like, well, that the isolation of the language can only be further exacerbated by just using all these huge words that really, you have to learn how to make it so your audience is a lot broader. And I think that's what a manifesto does, in a way, is that it charges people, but in a way it's so that I want to make it so my best friend in the world, can take it and read it and be like, I know what you're saying. I totally understand this. Like, I get it. Not only I understand the words you're saying, but I feel what you're saying. And that's what I think the difference between academic papers and manifestos are sometimes.
God, I don't know why, but your comments remind me of something that I saw when I was a kid, which still happens. All the Jewish kids in the Jewish neighborhoods of New York, they were at risk of being assimilated. I mean, every immigrant wave wants to assimilate, and I want to ask you about this. And so what would happen, and what probably still happens, is you send your kids after school to a secondary school, another school, a Hebrew school, and you learn Hebrew. And while you're learning the Hebrew, which is, you know, a very ancient language, a very cultural laden language, you also learn the culture. Yeah. And in that way you stay connected. And I'm not sure what the numbers are, whether it's more or less today than it was then, but I think every immigrant group, at least to the United States, at least had that possibility. Some did it more than others. Isn't this pretty much the same thing? I mean, it's like you could, when you say the pockets, you're going to Jamoran school, and when you sit there at Kakako Kitchen,
yeah,
talking to the extent you can in Chamorro, then you're also talking about the culture. You're doing the same thing that I did when I was a kid, and that, you know, the Italians did, and the French did, and everybody did, where the language was different, you know, and they tried to recapture not only the language, but the old country, essentially. The difference is the old country for you is the same place that it was. You know, you haven't, I mean, it's not like you left an old country to come somewhere else. The old country is the new country too.
Exactly. Same landscape. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, let me announce one more time that this is Ken Gofigan-Kuper, a graduate student at UH Manoa working on his master's in the area of revitalizing language and linguistics discussion. And the topic of our show is revitalizing language to preserve culture, which is very important. And he's at University of Hawaii Manoa in the Pacific Island Studies School there. I want to take it one step further in the last part of our discussion, Ken, and that is, you know, there's a tension, and you mentioned it earlier, between the need, the wish, the desire, the economic desire of a given immigrant group or a given culture group to assimilate and, you know, and talk like you come from Idaho. Or was it Iowa?
Iowa.
Thank you. And, you know, act like, dress like, appear to be in the mainstream of, say, American or Western culture. And maybe, as they said years ago, that would help you make more money in your life and realize your economic dreams and so forth, or to preserve. And the problem is that they may not be entirely consistent, and that if you have a bunch of kids who all want to go to Stanford and work on Wall Street, you know, are they going to pay attention to what you're saying? And in the end, isn't the assimilation thing going to be, you know, it's going to have an erosive effect on the ability to preserve the language and the culture. And if we had this conversation, say, 20 years from now, one full generation later, I fear to say, well, what do you think will happen 20 years from now if we had this conversation all over again?
Well, it depends on how effective the work that, you know, my mentors and elders are doing, the work that I'm doing, and the work that, you know, the generation after me does. I feel like there's a lot of hope. I feel that some more people, through years and years of oppression, we've survived. You know, our language still exists.
How many of there are you?
Oh.
How many of there are you? How many of you are there?
Let's see. Some more as well. I'm trying to think. You know, I don't really have a ballpark number because in Guam there's a population, you know, over 150,000, but we only make up about 37% of the population. Then you have those in the other islands. But then there are actually, what I've been told, there are more Chamorros in the diaspora than there are in our islands. So there are many in San Diego, many in Washington, many in Texas.
The old story.
Exactly. So I don't really have a number for you, but, you know, we exist, and we're going to continue to exist as long as we continue to do this work. I think that this conversation in 20 years, if we are successful, it will be that I would hopefully bring my son and daughter into the show and have them converse in Chamorro and have that be a session. Just my children.
It would show something.
Yes, you know what I mean? Like, I think that would be the most visual demonstration of how is the language doing, Ken? You know what I mean? Well, let me bring in my children for you, you know. Have them speak to you in our language, you know. Have them realize that they didn't have to struggle with English or tomorrow, they know both. And I think that's something very important, is that I'm hoping in 20 years that people don't realize that what we're trying to do is rule out English, right? Because you're talking about, kind of, whether we like it or not, we exist in this modern society. And English is I advocate for learning English. I think learning English is important because it is a lingua franca for many people. And so, but the thing is, and one of my mentors and elders and just genuine inspirations, Dr. Robert Underwood, he wrote that there's language of identity and language of utility. And the problem is, don't confuse the two. You are tomorrow, let that be your language of identity, but utility, if you want to go out to school, if you want to, start a business, if you want to just communicate with people from around the world, learn English, you know what I mean? Be bilingual, be a polyglot, exactly. There's no point in being monolingual, you don't have to be.
Not in the 21st century.
Yeah, and so I'm hoping that what we do is people realize that tomorrow language is just as important as English. But you can know both. In fact, you can go learn Chinese too. Learn 3, you know what I mean? And that would be the most important thing to take away from. It's not like, it's about shifting the paradigm of thought. It's not like, I speak tomorrow, you speak English. Let us clash now to see whose language is better. It's like, hey, you want to teach me English and I'll teach you tomorrow, and we can have more gifts for each other. You know what I mean? I think it's about that. It's kind of countering this binary oppositional thinking of English versus tomorrow, but realizing that take this opposition and instead put it together, make it so that the way you view the world is informed by not only the perspective of your ancestors, but you can take from these little areas that you want to, as you were saying. So hopefully in 20 years, my kids will be here talking, not here specifically, but you know what I mean.
What about your career, Because when you think of somebody who studies out of a passion, out of a cultural passion, you wonder if he's going to be able to get a job. Where does it go career-wise for you? I mean, I can see, for example, you could do a lot of writing about this subject. You could take it to a level where it would be interesting everywhere. But query is that the career you want? What do you plan?
Sure. Well, the next step for me is to apply for my PhD, and hopefully I get into political science. Because we talk about colonization, history, decolonization, but also the politics of language, what we've been talking about all day. And hopefully I can get my PhD in that, and then if I can, I would love to teach at the University of Guam, because that's where I was truly, kind of transformed into who I am today. And I'd love to be that for someone else.
You plan to go back?
Absolutely.
And live there? That's your home?
Oh, yes. I want to, if I could find a job, I get my PhD, move back home, settle down, raise my family, and continue to take youth under my wing and kind of have them have that transformational experience that I went through during college. And if not that, maybe, we have tomorrow language department at in the public schools. Maybe I can help with that, or even start my own immersion school. Which create some own music. I don't know, but I definitely would love to be a professor. I think that it allows me to continue, my research. It allows me to continue my activism. I get to attend conferences and make those connections we were talking about earlier. But most importantly is that when you teach, if you teach effectively and you are charismatic and you can engage people, you can transform lives. And so that's what I love to do. I just love to transform lives.
So what do you, aside from the language issue, which is easy enough to demonstrate with your kids and all that they can speak it or not speak it, it's easy to see. What about culturally? What kind of kids or group, a new network do you want to build? What is the model that you're advancing here?
Sure. Well, I guess I would love a generation in which not only can we speak our language, but we live our lives according to the values that our ancestors put for us and that we've continued to this day, because a lot of these values just stuck with us, and I hope that we can continue that. Another thing is I'd love for us to be not, there's emphasis on becoming educated tomorrows, right? But I went to a talk by this wonderful professor out in Maui. His name's Kalekua, and he told us that there's a difference between an educated Hawaiian and a person who is Hawaiian educated. And so I love to take that and hope that would describe the generation. I love a generation in which they're not the Stanford, if they are, that's fine, but if that's all they are, they're not just educated tomorrows, because it depends on whose education. So I love it to be tomorrow educated, in which they know our values, they know the language, they know the history. They have a more critical mind frame, because to exist in a highly militarized, highly marginalized society, I think having a critical frame of mind and having the ability to speak out is essential and absolute. So I would hope that my children are out there and my grandchildren are out there just equally with as much dedication and fiery passion talking about these issues, making these connections here today. I'm a Tomorrow man in the middle of Oahu, speaking to you about this. It's about that. And I think that having a Tomorrow educated generation is truly what we would hope for.
There's a harmony about that. It seems to me that if you practice the culture that your forefathers gave you,
and foremothers,
I use it in the generic sense, then you're more in harmony with your own identity.
Absolutely.
The other thing you said that really appeals to me is the notion of being bilingual and effectively bicultural. But you don't have to give up either one. You can maintain both.
Absolutely. Albert Wendt, a great oceanic writer, told us once, he talked about, I might be paraphrasing, but he said, you don't want your culture to drown in self-love, right? And so that's a very important thing. And then also, many writers have talked about, it's not about, for example, so tomorrows we have a lot of Western ways, because they've been introduced, we've kind of been forced upon a lot of them. But what we're not trying to do is kick out every single Western way. It's about choice. And it's about breaking down all these different Western ways and realizing, does this work for us? No? Get rid of it. Does this work for us? Absolutely. Let's keep it. Let's make it our own. Let's transform it.
Seeking value.
Exactly.
Seeking value that's value for both, or for all. And that means excellence. Seeking excellence in both areas. Absolutely. Well, this is a very noble thing you're doing. And I hope you continue it, and I would like to have a conversation, not in 20 years, but maybe in 20 days,
sure.
to find out how it's going with you.
All right.
Thank you, Ken.
Sanamasi.
Very nice. Take care. Aloha. Okay.
All right.
Very nice.
Thank you for that. Really, that was awesome.
Yeah, enjoyed that just as much as last week. Oops. Did you get good sound?
We're good.
All right.